So we're going to start with the absolute basics. The first thing to know about Google Sheets is you have to have a Google account to be able to use it. So if you don't have one already, make sure to sign up. And just to the left of the icon for your profile, you see these 9 little dots. That's where all the apps are located. So if you click into there, you'll see everything. The Google Drive is where all of your files are located. So you can click into that to open up a new sheet if you want to, or you can go down here to Sheets. When you click into Sheets, it'll open up a new page where it will show all of your recent spreadsheets. You can also click into different templates or open up a new blank spreadsheet. I just clicked on blank spreadsheet to open up a new spreadsheet. And up here you see untitled spreadsheet. That's currently the name of the file by default. So you can rename that by clicking on it and renaming it whatever you want. Once I press enter, just to the right, you'll see saving and then save to drive. And that's because Google Sheets automatically saves once you make edits. So you'll have a log of all your saves and you'll pretty much never lose your work. Now say you inherited a file and you need to make your own copy. You can hit File, Make a Copy, and this will clone the entire spreadsheet as is. So all of its contents will be exactly the same. Once you hit Make a Copy, it will open up a brand new spreadsheet that's called Copy of whatever the previous file was named. Once again, you can go in there and rename it to whatever you want it to be. In this case, I'm going to put Sheetsmith-Day1 to differentiate it from the other one. Now the entire file is called a spreadsheet. At the bottom, you'll see it says Sheet 1. That's called a sheet or a tab to some people. It's used interchangeably. But each spreadsheet is made up of multiple sheets that you can use. I just right-clicked on Sheet 1 and renamed it Tab 1. You can click the plus button in the bottom left-hand corner to add a new sheet, and I can rename that Tab 2. And if I want to duplicate the tab, I can right-click on the tab and hit Duplicate, and this will duplicate the entire tab with contents and all. And I'll rename that Tab 3. Now in the top right, there's a blue button with a person with a plus, and that's how you share your document with others. By default, only you have access when you create a new spreadsheet, so if you want to share it with others, you can add their email in. Then you'll select what type of permissions you want to give them. There are 3 types of permissions: viewer, commenter, and editor. So viewer can only view the file, commenter can view and comment, and editor can edit the whole thing. You can add a message if you want, and once you hit send, they'll receive an email with the link and any notes that you provided. And once I hit send, I can go back into that Sheets tab, and now I can see that new person is an editor. You can also change general access. You can change it to anyone with the link and then set that permission. So if anybody has that link, whether you shared it with them directly or not, it will still work. Up at the top, we have our menu, which is File, Edit, View, and so on. Clicking into File, you can select New, and you can open a new spreadsheet or a template. You can open up a file that already exists, import data from a file, make a copy as we just viewed. You can also share from here instead. You can email, you can download this in different types of forms, so Microsoft Excel, PDF, CSV, etc. You can rename the file from here instead of clicking on it above. You can move it to a new location in your drive. You can add a shortcut to your drive. You can also move it to trash if you don't want it anymore. And as I mentioned, whenever you make changes, a new version is saved, so you can access your version history right here. We'll get more into that later. Then you can go into the details or click on the settings. And the settings are important to know where this exists because you can change the location and the time zone for where the spreadsheet is being configured at. And due to regional differences, the spreadsheet will work in different ways based on the location that's selected. Under Edit, you have Undo, Redo, Cut, Copy, Paste, Paste Special. Values only is the main thing that I use from here, but there are other options as well. There's a lot of different options, but you can also right-click on the cell and do Paste Special straight from there. You can also delete rows straight from here if you want to. And then there's also Find and Replace, which you'll use quite a bit. But we'll get more into Find and Replace later. Under Show, you'll see Formula Bar. And the Formula Bar is usually pretty important because it shows the formula that drives the back end of the cell. But if you want to hide it from view, you can just uncheck it. And then if you want to add it back, just check it again. The light gray lines between all the cells are called grid lines. If you want to hide those, you can just go to Show, Uncheck Grid Lines, and it'll be blank. Then to add them back, just check it again. So as you can see in cell A1, it shows the results of the formula. If you want to see the formula itself, you can go to View, Show, Formulas, and it will show whatever formula exists in that cell. And this is a good way to see which cells have formulas versus which cells have values. That way you can make sure that everything is correct. But that should just be temporary, so we'll go ahead and uncheck that. You can also show protected ranges, which we'll go over a little bit later. And you can freeze rows or columns. You can freeze no rows, 1 row, 2 rows, or up to a certain row. And if you're not sure what I mean by freezing a row, whenever I scroll down, the top rows will become out of sight. So if I want those top rows to stay visible, then I'll be able to freeze the row to make sure they don't go away. So if I freeze the first row, you can see that the 0 stays visible no matter how far down I scroll. This is super important whenever you have things like headers, and that's because you want those to stay visible so you have context no matter where you are in the spreadsheet. And right now it says up to row 11, and that's because I have the cell selected in row 11. And you can also freeze columns in the same way, and it says up to column B, it's because I have column B selected for the cell. And if I selected a different cell, those options would change. And if you're not familiar with cells, all rows are numbered and all columns are lettered, and the combination of the two make up the cell location. Going back to view, you can group different cells or different columns right here. You can also increase or decrease the zoom and make it full screen. The next item in the menu is Insert, and this is based on the location you have selected as well. So you can insert more cells, more rows, more columns, another sheet, insert a chart, a pivot table, an image, a drawing. You can also find the list of functions, so if you want to see exactly what functions exist in Google Sheets, it's all right here. And if you want to drill into a certain type of function, it's there as well. You can also insert a link, a checkbox, dropdowns, emojis, different smart chips, different comments, and notes. Under Format, you can add a specific theme. 123 number has all the value formatting. By default, it's automatic. If I select plain text, you can see in A1 that the 0 is on the left side. And that's because even though it's a number technically, it's in text format, and text is always aligned on the left side. And this is important to know because if a number is formatted as a text, it won't work in any of your calculations. Then if I format it back as a number, it will automatically align back to the right side and be eligible to be in calculations. You can also format a number as a percent, scientific, accounting, financial, currency. And one thing about the standard currency format is it will always default to the location of your spreadsheet. You can also have currency rounded. You can have the date, the time, the date time, duration, or different custom formatting. Now, even though you have all these options under Format, you probably won't go there very often to access them. In the toolbar, there's a 1, 2, 3, and under there it has all the same options. Under Format, you can also format text, so you have bold, italic, underline, and strike through. And once again, all these options exist in the toolbar, so you probably won't go there very often. And then you also have alignment, wrapping, and rotation, as well as font size. And as you guessed it, these all exist in the toolbar as well because we use them all the time to make it simple. Now you will use conditional formatting all the time, so we're going to spend a decent amount of time on that. Then you can also do alternating colors. And for alternating colors, it's just a simple way to format a table. So you have the header as one color, and then after that, it will alternate between color 1 and color 2 until the end of the table. And then lastly, you have clear formatting. The next item is data, and you'll probably use this a good amount. In here, you can sort sheet, you can sort a range, you can create a filter, you can create a filter view, you can add a slicer, you can protect the sheets and ranges, add name ranges, add name functions. And a lot of these we're going to go into more in depth as we progress through our series. You can see column stats, you can see data validation, which is super important. You can do some data cleanup to remove duplicates, trim white space, split text to columns, data extraction, and you can link some databases if you want to. Under tools, you can create a form, and this will link a Google form directly to your spreadsheet for the data to come in. You can find things like spell check, autocomplete, explore, notification settings, and accessibility. And then under extensions, this is where you would add any add-ons. So if you have any third-party systems that you want to bring in to complete different tasks. You can also record any macros, develop an app script automation, or create an app sheet. And then under help, even though you won't use it that much, this is a good place to search menus, have different trainings, different updates. Basically anything that you want to increase your skills or troubleshoot will be found here. The function list is the same exact list that you saw under insert with every single formula. And if you want to use any hotkeys or keyboard shortcuts, as they say here, you can find the list of everything that works right here. The first icon on the toolbar is to search the menus, and you can use this to search for different functions, and it also shows you all the recent functions that you've used. So mainly it's there to save some time. Just to the right of that, you have the undo button, which will undo your last edit. Then to the right of that, you have your redo button, which will redo the last edit that you undid. Then you have your print button, and then paint format. And for paint format, you can highlight the cell that you want to paint, click paint format, and then click a different cell, and it will copy the formatting exactly. Next up, we have our zoom. By default, it's always 100%, but it's super easy to increase it to say 150, or you can decrease it back. And this is important when you're sharing your screen with others so they can actually see what you're doing. Next up, we have format as currency, and it's exactly as it sounds. Then we have percentage. Then just to the right, we can decrease our decimals. And then to the right of that, we can increase our decimals back. Now this icon that says 123 holds all of the formatting that you saw in the previous video. By default, the cell is set to automatic, but if I change it to plain text, you can see that the alignment shifts to the left side. And that's because since it's text, the system is no longer recognizing it as a number, and it's reading it the same exact way as it would read Happy Sheetsmith. This is important to know because if any numbers are formatted as text, they will not be included in any calculations. Now if I format it as a number, it aligns back to the right side, which is default for numbers. And if I wanted to, I could format it as any of these options. And this includes dates. So dates are actually numbers on the back end. They're just visualized as dates. So for example, the number 2 is correlated with January 1st, 1900. And if I typed in today's date, which is December 3rd, 2023, I would be able to change the date to number format, and I would be able to find out what number it correlates to. And it's the same exact thing as 45,263. Now, realistically, you don't need to know or worry about what number correlates with each date. It's just set up this way. That way you can do different operators like greater than or equals to, not equal to, and so forth. So that's just for you to understand what's happening on the back end, but you can just type dates. Just to the right, we have our font. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Happy Sheetsmith and change that to Lobster. Next up, you see 3 little dots, and you won't see that on your screen. It's only there because I'm using a super small screen for the video. So the next thing you'll see is font, so you can change the font size if you'd like. Now the next few icons should look super familiar, and that's because they're used all over the place. So we have bold, italics, or strike through. Then that A to the right, you can change the font color, so I can change that to red. Then the little paint bucket, you can change the fill color, so that's the background color, and I'm going to change that to gray. Now the 4 little boxes to the right is where you add the borders. You can add all borders, inner borders, and you can look at the icon to see what the border would look like. You can also add horizontal borders, vertical borders, outside borders, the left border only, the top border only, the right border only, or the bottom border only, and then you can clear borders altogether. By clicking the pen, you can change the color of the border, and then one icon down, this is where you can change the type of border it is. And that can be a different border type entirely, or just the thickness. So to demonstrate, I'm going to go ahead and select Arrange. Then I can go to the borders and select all borders. I can change the color to blue, so I have only blue outlines. And then I can change the style of the border to a dotted line. Then if I change my mind on the border, I can just select Clear Border and everything's gone. Now I'm going to go select Happy Sheetsmith as well as the cell just to the right of it. Then I'll go to the Merge Cells icon. And once I click that, instead of having 2 cells, I'll have one giant cell. So you can see in row 2, I have 2 different cells in columns A and B, but in row 1, I only have 1. There is a time and a place to merge cells, but be careful with this because if a merged cell falls within a range that you're trying to build a formula off of, the formula will be affected and it won't work. Right now the text is aligned to the left, but I can go ahead and change that to center alignment, and now it's aligned between both columns. Now to demonstrate the next icon, I'm going to make the row a bit bigger. And now I can go back to my toolbar and select the vertical alignment, and I'm going to change that to middle. So now you can see that the text is aligned in the middle of the cell instead of at the bottom of the cell. The next icon is text wrapping, and it means different things. I'm going to go ahead and add a sample sentence. And you probably notice that the sentence runs slightly over into the next cell. Now if I type something into the next cell, it will cut off the previous cell. But if not, this is where text wrapping comes into play. Now I'll select the previous cell that contains the text, and if I go back to my toolbar, I can select Overflow, and that will overflow just like we saw before. If I select Wrap, it will stack on top of each other and be maintained in the same cell. And if I select Clip, it will automatically stop at the end of the cell, whether or not the following cell has text in it. So if I clear the text from the following cell, you can see that it still stops, and once I change it to Overflow, it will overflow back into that cell. The next icon is text rotation, and it's exactly as it sounds. You can rotate the text to be at different angles. You can make it diagonal, you can make it vertical, or anything in between. The next icon is to add a link, so all you have to do is copy a URL and you can paste that in there. And once you press enter, whenever you click on that cell, it will link to that new page. The next icon is to insert a comment, so you can add somebody if you want to mention them to alert them of something, or you can just make a comment for yourself. Once it's resolved, you can click the little check button and it will go away. So comments are meant to be something temporary while you work things out. Now going back to the toolbar just to the right of the comment icon, you can insert a chart. You can also add filters, that way you can filter your data super easily. You can add filtered views, or you can look at all the different functions that exist in the system. And this is good when you know something exists but you're not sure on the exact spelling, or you can always just Google something. So a cell is all these different gray boxes that you see all over the spreadsheet. And inside a cell is where you hold your values or your formulas. When you click on a cell, it'll be bordered in blue with a little circle in the bottom right. And the corresponding column and row will highlight blue. That way it's super easy to determine which cell you clicked. Every single cell has a label, and it's made up of the column letter followed by the row number. And you can see it in the name box in the top left corner. So for example, this is C7, now we have C12, and now we have F15. And when you build formulas, you need to know what cells you're working with and what cells you want to work with. So it's super important to be able to understand what the names are for each cell. Now when you select a range of cells, the top left cell will be the cell that you start with. So it will be B4 in this situation. There'll be a colon in between, and then the bottom right cell will be what you end with. So it would be D16 in this case. Alright, so when it comes to formatting, the main thing is you want it to be presentable, and you can do as little or as much formatting as you want depending on the situation. And the easiest way to make it presentable is to highlight the entire table, go to Format, Alternating Colors, and then select one of these options. Once you hit Done, you'll have the header in one darker color, and then you'll have 2 colors that are rotating for the rest of the table. And I can evolve from there if I want. So for example, I can select the headers, then I can go to my toolbar and make it bold. And if you're looking for these 3 little dots, they won't be there. They're only there because I'm working on a super small screen for this video. But once you press the big B, the headers will be bolded. Now you can select columns A through D, and you can select the line between the columns to adjust the width of the format. And since they're all selected, everything will be identical width. And if you double click the line instead, it will snap to fit the biggest value in the column. So for example, Matthew Hernandez is the longest value in column C, so that's what's determining the width of column C. You can also adjust the columns one by clicking the line between the 2 columns and moving them one at a time. Now as you can see, the headers in both columns B and column C are now cut off. So company size, we only see company, and sales associate, we only see sales associate. But if we want to see the whole header, we can go to the toolbar and click Wrap, and then the text will be stacked on top of each other instead. And this is a good way to save space, since typically headers can be longer than the values underneath. Another thing you can do to save space is rotate the text. So I can go to the toolbar, then go to text rotation, and then make it vertical. So now you can see that the text is vertical, but company is split, so it looks a little funny. So I can go ahead and drag down the row, and now it looks normal. But just to keep things uniform, I'm going to go ahead and undo those changes. Now I showed you how to format cells based on alternating colors, but you can format one single cell at a time. So for example, I can select Jane Johnson, then go to the toolbar, and I can make it italicized, strike through, bold. I can make the font bigger if I want to. I can also change the font entirely, so I can change the font to Lobster. And I can also overwrite the alternating colors to make it a different color. So I can go to the Fill button and make that a dark blue, and I can make the text a white. So now for that cell, instead of seeing alternating colors, we have a dark blue background with white text. And if you don't like any of the colors that are preloaded in there, but you do have access to the color that you do want, you can use the little dropper and click the color that you want, and it will automatically be uploaded into the system. And that works for text, and it also works for fill, so I can use the dropper and then click this dark green, for example. So now I have a dark green background and a light blue text. And the best part about doing this is once you select it once, it will automatically be added to the custom colors list, so you can select it super easily going forward. And you can also click on the plus button to add a color manually. Alright, so that's a good overview of text formatting, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize the toolbar. Alright, so we have this table nice and formatted, but when I scroll down, the headers get lost, so I have no idea what exactly these values are referring to because there's no headers to remind me. But there's a super easy way to fix that by freezing rows. If you remember from my previous video, you can go to View, Freeze, and you can freeze rows that way, but that's actually not the easiest way. The easiest way is to hover over the dark gray line in the top left corner and drag that to where you want it to be. So I'm going to drag it down to below row 1. Now when I scroll down, the top row remains in sight. And you can do the same exact thing for columns by dragging the dark gray line over to where you want it. And then when you scroll to the right, you'll still see those columns. In this case, I don't need to freeze any columns, so I'm going to change that back. Now all in all, this table looks pretty presentable as it is, but one thing you can do to elevate things a little bit further is to add some borders. So we'll go to the toolbar and then click on Borders, Add All Borders. And now we'll see little black lines on all sides of every cell that we have selected in that range. Now let's say we don't want to have all borders, we can go ahead and click on Clear Borders instead. And I can select a different option like Inside Borders, where it has all the inside borders but nothing around the outside. In this case, I do want all borders. I can go to the pencil in the top right and change the color, so I can change it to red, for example. Then I can also change the style, so it can be dotted lines instead. Now I'm going to select one single column, that way I can highlight it very easily. And I'll select Borders Only and make it red. So that's a super easy way to visually highlight a single column if you want to. Now that we're done with all of our basic foundations, we're going to start with some basic aggregate formulas. And don't let the word aggregate scare you, it's just these formulas and you probably already know them from grade school. But before you configure any formulas at any time, whether you're new or old, it's always important to understand your data. So in column A, we have our region. In column B, we have our company size. In column C, we have our sales associates. And in column D, we have our amounts. We're going to build our first formula in B2, which you should be able to locate after our last video. And once you double click on it, you should see a little line in the left corner blinking. That means that you're good to start typing. Every formula starts with equals, and that's how it determines if it's a formula or text. And then in the little window that pops up, it'll show you exactly what is needed and in what order to complete the formula. If you need more details, you can click the caret in the right-hand corner, and it will give you an example as well as more information. Now when it comes to selecting the range for the formula, you can select each cell individually separated by a comma, or you can select the entire range all at once. But more often than not, you'll just select the entire range all at one time. Alright, so once we press enter, we have the results of our sum formula. And if you don't know what sum means, that just means we want to add all these values together. And if you select the range, you can also get the information that you want in the bottom right-hand corner without any formulas. But this information is kind of an FYI to have a quick analysis as opposed to having the formulas where you can build other formulas off of these formulas. But you can see both of these sum results are 95,350, so that means our calculation is correct. Next is the count formula, and the count formula will only apply to numbers. So we'll type equals count, it will give us the information that we need, and all we want to do is select the range. And since the count formula will only work for numbers, we only really have one option to choose from, and that's column D. So we'll choose the range in column D. And once we press enter, we'll get 30, and that's because there's 30 values there because there's 30 rows of data. And most importantly, all of our rows have an amount, which is not always the case, so be careful about that. The next formula is the count A formula, and it's the same exact thing as the count formula, but it will work for any values. So it doesn't matter if it's a number, a text, or whatever, it will work if it's there. So I'm going to select my range, and this time I'm going to include the header as well, just for an example. So once I press enter, I'll have 31 instead of 30, and that's because it reads that header as a value, even though that's not something that we really intended to count. But to fix that, we can just edit that from the formula bar. So instead of starting with C10, we'll start with C11. And this is where understanding cell location, as we talked about in the last video, comes into play. And if you don't remember the location, you can just click on the cell, then look up at the column and then at the row, and that's your cell location. For average, we'll type equals average. And pay attention because Google will try to recommend different formulas to help speed things up, but they're not always correct. So we're going to not choose that top average, we'll choose the second average and select the range ourselves. And then once we press enter, we'll have the average of the range. For median, we'll type equals median, and we'll select the second option for the same reason as last time, and then we'll select the range ourselves. And once we press enter, we'll have the median value of the range. The next formula is the min formula, and we'll use this to find the minimum value in the range. So we'll type equals min, and then we'll select the range that we want to look up. And once we press enter, we'll have the lowest value that exists. And lastly, we have the max formula, which will find the maximum value in the range. So we'll go ahead and type equals max, and then select the range. And once you press enter, we'll have the largest value that exists in the range. Now, if you noticed, I included the header in the range this time, and it doesn't affect the actual result itself, but it will affect the formatting. And the result format came out as text, and that's because we have both text and currency formats in the range. But if I remove the header, then it automatically defaults to currency. And once again, we can select the range, and we can see that every single one of these items in the bottom right-hand corner match our results. We're going to talk about some more advanced aggregate formulas. These formulas should look very familiar. The only difference is it has an if or an ifs at the end of them. Instead of doing just the sum formula, for example, we're doing a sum if formula. So we're going to sum up the numbers if a specific criteria exists. And there are different criteria types. You can do text, which always has to be in quotes. You can reference a cell. You can have an operator, so like greater than or equal to a number in quotes. And then there's different wildcards like a question mark or an asterisk. The question mark wildcard replaces one character. So for example, if I have TEX question mark, it could be TEXT, TEXS, or whatever that last character is, but it will only be one character. The asterisk, on the other hand, could be any amount of characters. So for example, if I have TE asterisk, I could have Tennessee, I could have Texas, I could have text, or whatever. And then lastly, if I have asterisk then ST, it could be any amount of characters before as long as it ends in XT. So as I mentioned, the sum if formula is just summing the amounts if a specific criteria exists. So we'll type equals sum if, and then we'll select the range, which is the criterion range. And if you're not sure which range is the criteria range, think about what you're trying to look up, which criteria you're trying to find, and the range has to include that value. So for this example, we want to add up everything that's enterprise. So the criteria range would be in column B where the company size is. And we'll use the first type of criteria. So after a comma, we'll type enterprise in quotes. Then the last step is to select the sum range that you want to add up. And then once I press enter, I'll have all the amounts added up for every enterprise company listed. Next up is the sum ifs formula. This is the same exact thing as sum if. The only difference is you can have multiple criteria except for just one. So for the formula, we'll type equals sum ifs. And one thing that's different is instead of having the sum range selected at the end of the formula, we start with the sum range here instead. And this will allow us to follow it with as many criteria as we want. So I'll select the sum range, then I'll put a comma. And now we're going to select the first criteria range. In this case, I'm going to do the region. And for another example of text, we'll put North America in quotes. Remember, all text has to have quotes at all times for it to work. And now for the second criteria range, we're going to select company size. And for the criteria itself, I'm going to select mid-market. But instead of typing it out, I'm just going to put a comma, and I'm going to select a cell that has mid-market within it. And you can see up in the formula bar, the criteria is represented by B13. Now, a super important thing to understand is since this is a cell reference, if you change the contents of this cell from mid-market to say enterprise, the new criteria will be enterprise instead of mid-market. But this is actually a good thing if you use it strategically. So we got $26,000 that are in North America and mid-market. Now for count if, we're going to count up everything if a specific criteria exists. So the criterion range in this case is going to be the amount. And we'll use an operator as the criteria. So for example, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, not equal to, so forth. And since the system reads it as text, we have to have it in quotes just like a regular text. So we'll put quote, greater than or equal to 2,000, quote. So with this formula, the system will only include amounts that are $2,000 or greater in the count. And you can see that there's 20 values that meet this criteria. Now for count ifs, you can have multiple criteria. So for example, if we do count ifs, then we can select a criteria range. For this example, we'll select region, and then I'll select Europe as a cell reference, just as another example. And as you can see in the formula bar, it now says the criteria is A11. For the second criteria range, I'm going to select company size. And for this criteria, we're going to use our first wildcard. So we're going to use the question mark. So for that, I'll put quote, ENTERPRIS, question mark, quote. And once again, if it starts with ENTERPRIS, it doesn't matter if it ends in T, Y, X, whatever it ends in, as long as it's one character long. And if it meets that criteria, it will be included in the count. So now we have the count for all European companies that are enterprise on this list. And you can see that there are 9 of them. Now by now, I'm sure you understand the difference between if and ifs. If allows for one criteria, ifs allows for multiple criteria. And with if, whatever you're trying to average or sum will go last. And with ifs, whatever you're trying to average or sum will go first. So this works pretty much the same exact way as that sum formula. It's just taking the average instead of the sum. So for average if, we'll type equals average if. Then we'll select the criterion range. And I'm going to use an asterisk wildcard. So I'll put quote, north, asterisk, quote. And the asterisk allows for any amount of characters. So it doesn't matter if this is North America, North Africa, Northern Australia, Northern, whatever. It'll be included in the criteria. Then after a comma, we'll select the range that we want to average. And we got the total of $3,100. And in this case, it's everything that's in North America. But if it had North Africa or any other results in there, it would still be included in that north asterisk wildcard. And lastly, we have average ifs. So we'll type equals average ifs. And then we're going to select our average range first this time. So we'll select all the amounts. And then just like our sum ifs formula, we can have as many criteria as we want. So for the first criterion, we're going to put the criteria range as company size. And once again, we're going to use this asterisk wildcard. But instead of having it at the end, we're going to put it at the front. So we're going to put quote, asterisk, ISE, quote. And this will include any values that end in ISE, no matter how many characters are before it. For the second criteria range, we're going to select the region. And we're going to use the asterisk wildcard again, but this time we're going to use it surrounding text. So we'll put quote, asterisk A, asterisk quote. And since we can have as many characters before or after the letter A, as long as A exists anywhere in the value, it will be included in the criterion. So for this example, both North America and Asia Pacific have an A in it, so those will both be included in that criteria. And we're going to talk about the VLookup formula. And the purpose of the VLookup formula is to look for a search key within a data range and then return correlated values. So for example, we're going to look up these employee names within this data range, and I'm going to return the quantity sold and the totals. So we'll type equals VLookup, and then we'll select our search key. In this case, it's going to be John Smith, and then we'll select our range. And the most important thing to know about VLookup is the first column of the range has to be the one that contains the search key. And we can only return values to the right of that column. Next is the index, and this is the number of the column that we want to return. And in this example, I want to return number 3, which is column C. And lastly, we'll put a 0 because we want it to be an exact match. Now, if I drag formulas down or over, the range will shift with it, so we want to anchor in the range. Once you anchor it in with $signs, it will become an absolute reference and will not move no matter where the formula goes. And now I can click on the fill handle, which is the little blue circle in the bottom right-hand corner, and I can drag the same formula down to the end of the column. Now we want to do the same exact thing, but instead of quantity sold, we want to have the total, so I'll drag the formula to the right. And you can see here that we got an NA error, and that's because it's trying to look up column B instead of column A because I did not anchor in column A. And obviously it's not going to find an employee named 66, so I'm going to go ahead back into the first formula and I'm going to anchor in column A, and then I'll be able to drag that formula over with no problem. But we're only anchoring in column A. We want to leave column 2 unanchored so that way we can shift it down with the formula. We're going to change the index from number 3 to the number 4 since total is in the 4th column of the range. And then once again, I'll use that fill handle to drag the formula down. So both of these formulas are using 0 at the end, and that's because we want to return the exact match. But sometimes we don't want an exact match, we want a relative match instead. So let me show you how to do it. So for example, here we want to look at the total and we want to see what commission it qualifies for. So we'll do equals VLookup, and then we'll select the total as our search key. And then the totals and commissions are in a table in the top right corner, so we'll select that as our range. We'll put a 2, and then we'll select 1 for the match. And once again, we need to anchor in the range. That way it doesn't move when we shift down our formula. And now we're good to go. So I'll go ahead and click on the formula and use the fill handle to drag that formula down to the end of the column. And what this formula is doing is it's looking at the total amount that we have and it's comparing it to this table. So for example, 615 is between 500 and 750. So it's returning a 3% since that's what it qualifies for. Likewise, 825 is between 750 and 1000. So it's returning a 5% commission. So that's how to use VLookup with an exact or a relative match. And we're going to talk about the XLookup formula. And if you saw day 8, we went over VLookup, and VLookup and XLookup are very similar. XLookup is just a lot better. And the whole point of XLookup is to search a value within a data range and return any correlated data. So we'll type equals XLookup, and then we need a search key, and the search key needs to be unique for this to work properly. So I'll select the employee number and then go to the data tab, and the lookup range needs to be the column that includes that search key. So in this case, it's the employee number as well. Then I'll select the return range in column A, which is what contains the associates. I'll put quote to quote to return blanks if it's missing. And then I'll put a 0 to be an exact match. And then I'll use the fill handle to drag that formula down. And you might notice that once the employee numbers end, the return values are blank as well. But if we add an employee number, the data will pop up automatically. Now before we shift the formula over, we need to add in some anchoring to avoid them from shifting. So we need to anchor in the lookup range as well as column A in the search key. And it's okay for everything else to shift as we move around the formula. So I'm going to click on cell B2 and use the fill handle to drag the formula to the right under start date. You can see it updated to be the employee ID, and that's because on our data set, the employee ID is one column to the right of associate. But we actually want the start date, which is column C, so I'll update that manually. I'll keep everything the same, and then I'll use the fill handle to drag that formula down. Once again, I'll go past where we have data, that way I can add in data automatically later on if I want to. Now I'll use the fill handle to drag that formula over to the right. And you can see that department and status updated automatically and correctly, and that's because they're in the same order on the data tab. Alright, so I'll drag that down, and now we're done with the exact matches. And the way that I configured it, I'm able to add additional employee numbers, and the data populates automatically. And in my opinion, this is best practice. That way you can automate your spreadsheets as much as possible and require a minimal upkeep. So as I mentioned, all the formulas we did have an exact match, and that's where we looked up a value, and then we returned the exact value that's correlated. But that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes we want to have a relative match. So for example, what if I want to have people that fall within different start dates have different tiers assigned? And this is super simple as well. We'll use the same XLookup function. We'll just use a relative match instead. So we'll type equals XLookup, and then this time the search key will be the start date. And then we'll go to our data tab where we have the different table for the start dates and tiers, and we'll select the start date for the lookup range and the tier for the return range. Once again, if a missing value, we're going to put quote, quote, so it's blank. And then for the match mode, we're going to put a -1. With the -1 match mode, it will look at the search key and it will return the value that is less than that search key, but the closest it can be. So since February 2014 is greater than January 2014, it returned legacy. And now I can use that fill handle to drag this down to the rest of the rows. You can see once we crossed over that next threshold of January 2018, it went to established, and then January 2022, it went to new. So that's XLookup, which is way better than VLookup in my opinion. We're going to talk about dropdowns and checkboxes. And knowing how to use these will save you a lot of time and elevate your spreadsheets. The easiest way is to select your cell, then click on Insert, then Checkbox or Dropdown. But the official way is to go to Data, Data Validation, Add Rule, and then use the dropdown here. And there's two types of dropdowns. One is to enter the options manually, and the second is to drop down from a range, and we'll go over that in a second. Now with the manual way, I'm going to create a dropdown for company size. So I'll type Enterprise, then Mid-Market, and then Small Business. And I want to make sure that these options match spelling exactly. That way we can set it up for a formula later on. And then I can use the little drop downs on the left to add a different color for each of them. Now if I go to advanced options, I can change the display style. So by default it's chip, and that's with the little round edges. I can go to arrow, which is the full cell, or plain text that has no arrow at all. I can also select what to do if the data is invalid, and I can show the help text as well. But in this case I have what I need, so I'm going to go ahead and press done. And once I exit out of my data validation rules editor, I can use the dropdown and you can see that it looks exactly as I planned. Now for our second dropdown, I'm going to create one for region. This time I'm going to go to Insert Dropdown, and you can see that it went to the same exact place that we were before. Now I'm going to use the criteria dropdown to select dropdown from a range, and then I'll select the entire region range minus the header. And what this does is it extracts all the unique values and turns them into options. And once again, you can select different colors for each options, and you can also add advanced options if you'd like. Now I'm going to exit out of the editor, and we're all set with our dropdowns. Now, if you remember from day 6, we went over some advanced aggregate formulas, and this one is one that we built for sum if. So now we're going to make it dynamic. So instead of having the criteria be enterprise, we're just going to select cell A2. And now when we select a different company size in A2, it will show us the total for each option. Now on day 6, we also built a sum if formula in B3. And this is built on both the region and the company size for criterion. So instead of the criteria North America, I'm going to select A3. And instead of the criteria for mid-market, I'm going to select A2. And now our formula is dynamic. And just like last time, whenever we select different options, the formula will automatically update the sum. But this time, instead of having one criterion, it's having two criterion. So for example, right now it's showing 5,000 for North America and Enterprise. And this is actually related to the top line right here, since that's the only one in our dataset that meets both criteria. Now next up is checkboxes, and unlike Excel, they're super simple in Google Sheets. So you can go to Insert, then select Checkboxes, and it will insert a checkbox right within the cell. And one thing to know is if a checkbox is unchecked, it's equal to false, and if it's checked, it's equal to true. Now I'll go the official way, so I'll go to Data, Data Validation, Add Rule, and then I'll use the criteria dropdown to select checkbox. And in here I can select Use Custom Cell Values, so instead of checked being true and unchecked being false, I can change that so I can make checked be good and unchecked be bad. I can also go to the advanced options and show help text if I'd like, or if the data is invalid I can show a warning or reject the input. So now I'll exit out of the editor, and in the formula bar you can see that when it's unchecked it's equal to bad, and when it's checked it's equal to good. Now since a checkbox is actually just a visual representation of two items, I don't want good or bad, I want it to have the regular true or false. So I'm going to select all the rows and go to Insert Checkbox, and now I have my true or false again. And this is important when it comes to building formulas, which you'll see in the next video. We're going to talk about text manipulation. And this is actually a pretty simple and straightforward concept. Up here in the top left, I have a bunch of formulas that you can use to manipulate text. The first formula is split, so we'll type equals split. And then we'll need to select what text we want to split. So I'll go down here and select cell C11, which contains John Smith. Then I'll put a comma, and then we need the delimiter. And delimiter is just a fancy word for a character. So basically, we're just telling it where we want the split to occur. I want it to occur on the space, so I'll put quote, space, quote. Now you can see we have John in the first column and Smith in the second column. Now if the value changes, so it's John, comma, Smith instead of John, space, Smith, the delimiter will need to be updated as well. And once the delimiter is updated to a comma, you'll see John and Smith separated in different columns again, and the comma will disappear altogether. The opposite of split is join, so I'm going to type equals join, and this time we need the delimiter first. And just for example's sake, I'm going to put quote dash quote. Then I'll select the value or array, and array just means range, so I'll select B2 and C2. And once I press enter, you'll see everything is combined to John dash Smith. And if I replace the dash with a space, it'll be John Smith just like normal. And as I mentioned, the delimiter can be pretty much anything, so it could be a single character or it could be a whole block of text. So for example, I could put quote space M period space quote, and then I would have John space M period space Smith, as if his middle name starts with an M. So that's one way to join text together. There's another way that I usually prefer to do, and that's just to put an ampersand between anything that I want to join. And if you don't know what an ampersand is, it's just the and symbol. So for example, I could put equals B2 and quote space quote and C2, and now I have John space Smith. But where this comes in handy is I can join things in whatever order I want. So for example, instead of having John Smith, I can do equals C2 ampersand quote space quote ampersand B2, and now I have Smith space John instead. Now the next three formulas have to do more so with data cleaning. So you can see here that we have a lot of names that have uppercase and lowercase letters really random. So we're going to fix that. So we'll type equals proper, and then we'll select one of those names that are random. And once I press enter, you'll see that everything is capitalized in the normal way that we're used to seeing, or the proper way, if you will. Next is upper, and you can type equals upper, then select a value. And as I bet you guessed, all characters are now uppercase. In the exact opposite, you can type equals lower and then select a value, and now every single character is lowercase. And which one you need to use, if any of them, will depend on what company you work for and what kind of processes are in place. Next up is the left formula, and what the purpose of this is to extract a certain amount of characters from the value. So I'll type equals left, and then I'll select A11, I'll put comma, then 3. And you can see that now we have NOR, which is the first three characters, or we have three characters from the left side. Conversely, we have right, so we can type equals right, and then we'll select B12, and then we'll put 5. And then we'll have the last 5 characters in this cell, also known as 5 characters from the right. Now this is something that you're going to encounter pretty quickly if you haven't already, and that's when you have headers going across horizontally that need to be vertically or vice versa. So for example, I have region, company size, sales associate, and amount listed horizontally, but if I wanted to have them listed vertically instead, I could do equals transpose, and then select that range. And then once I press enter, I'll have that same exact values listed vertically instead. So as I just showed you, it works horizontal to vertical, but it also works vertically to horizontally instead. So I can type equals transpose, then I can select that vertical range that I just made, and now we'll see it horizontally. So this is something super simple to save time as well as a headache trying to reformat things. I'm going to go ahead and delete all those values, and now we're going to talk about unique. And unique is pretty straightforward as well, and it comes in handy pretty quickly. You can type equals unique and then select a range, and it will give you all unique values. So as you can see, out of that entire list, North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific are the only 3 values. There's just a lot of duplicates. And going back to our previous day, you can easily do unique, and then you can do count if with a cell reference to find out how many times each one of these values appear in that list. And last up is sequence, so you can type equals sequence. The first thing you'll need is the row, and then the column. Then you can select what number to start with, as well as what incremental step you want to do. But the only thing absolutely required is the number of rows. I can type equals 15 and I'll get a list of 15. I can put comma 2 and I'll have 2 lists of 15 alternating in order all the way from 1 to 30. I'm going to change that back to 1 column long, and I'm going to change the starting amount to 20. So now I have a list starting with 20. That's 15 rows long and 1 column wide. And lastly, I can change the step to 5. So instead of having an increment of 1, I'll have an increment of 5 instead. And sequence can be pretty fun. You can use it to create a calendar, and you can also use it to create an automatic counter by combining it with a count A formula. In conditional formatting, it's exactly as it sounds. It will only format the text if a specific condition exists. You'll use this all the time, so let's get started. The first thing you'll need to do is select the range you want to format, then go to Format, Conditional Formatting. And under the Format Cells If dropdown, here's all the different options you have for conditional formatting. And the top section has to do with text, the middle section is dates, and the bottom section is numbers. So for example, I can set up a rule where if the text is exactly west, then the background will be blue, the text will be white, and it's bold. And now you can see that any of the regions that are west have the format we just set up. And if I were to change one of the regions to say west, the format will automatically apply. So that's if the text was an exact match, but what if we want to have a partial match? So we can have format conditional formatting, and if I click on the original rule and then press add another rule, it will duplicate that rule. And I don't really need to do that here, but it's good to know. So I'm going to change the format cells if from text is exactly to text contains, and then I'll change west to north. And this will format anything that contains the word north no matter what other text is present. I'll change the fill color to green, the text to black, and then I'll make it italicized and remove the bold. And now you can see that both northeast and northwest are highlighted with that new conditional formatting, and that's because both include the word north. So that's a few examples for text. You can also conditionally format numbers. So I'll highlight column C, then go to Format, Conditional Formatting. And this time I'll use the Format Cells dropdown to select greater than or equal to, and it works just like the normal operator. In the text box below, I'll put 50 and then change the fill color to dark green. And now anything that has a quantity sold over 50 will be highlighted in the dark green. Now all of these examples have been pretty straightforward, but you can also set up conditional formatting based on a custom formula. So for example, if I want to change the formatting of the employee based on whether or not the checkbox is checked in column E, I can do that. So I'll highlight the employees, then go to Format Conditional Formatting, change the format cells if to custom formula is, and then put equals E2 equals true. And a super important part of this is to make sure that the row in your formula matches the first row in your range. I'll change the fill color to dark gray, make it strike through in bold, and then change the text color to white. Now, if you remember from day 11 where we talked about checkboxes, I mentioned that checkboxes are simply a visual representation of two values, and by default, those values are true and false. When the box is unchecked, it's false, and when it's checked, it's true. And that's why when I built the formula, I said if E2 equals true, then apply the formula. So as I go down and check the boxes in column E, the formatting for the employees in column B will update automatically. We're going to talk about date formatting. And if you're looking to format a value as a default date, all you have to do is click on the cell or the range, then go to Format, Number, then click on Date. The default date format will depend on what location your spreadsheet is set to. Every single date has a number on the back end, and that's what makes it possible to do formulas, but you don't need to worry about the number. All you can do is focus on the dates. Now let's say you only wanted to show the month, but you wanted to keep it as a date, that way you can do calculations with it. I'm going to put equals A2 and then anchor in column A. If you don't know about cell anchoring, go back and watch day 8. And now I'll keep referencing column A even if I drag the formula to the right. Now to show only the month, I'll select 1, 2, 3 in the toolbar and then select custom date and time. And if I click on month, I can select different options regarding its number as well as how to spell it out. In this case, I want the abbreviation only. I'll click on date and year and delete both of them as well as the 2 slashes and then hit apply. And now I can double click on the fill handle in the bottom right hand corner to apply that formula to the rest of the rows. Now I'm going to use the fill handle to drag the formula over to day. And what we want here is to show the full day of the week. So I'll select the cell, go to 1, 2, 3 in the toolbar, and then select custom date and time. And then I'll delete month. Then I'll use the drop down to select day. And I can either do the day with numbers, abbreviations, or the full name. I want the full name in this case, and I'll hit apply. And once again, I'll double click on the fill handle to apply that formula down to the end of the rows. And I'm going to drag the formula over to the right to set up the year. So I'll go back to 1, 2, 3, select custom date and time. I'll delete day, and this time I'm going to use the drop down to select year. And year can be formatted with 2 digits or 4. I'm going to select 4 digits, then hit apply. And I can double click on the fill handle to apply that formula down to the rest of the rows. Now I live in the United States where we format our dates as month, day, year, but I work for an international company, so a lot of times I need to put it in day, month, year instead, or vice versa. So to do so, I can select the cell that contains the date, go to 1, 2, 3, custom date and time. I'll delete the format that's already there, and then I'll use the drop down to select the desired format. So I'll put day with the leading 0, then I'll put a slash, then I'll put month with the leading 0, another slash, and then I'll put a year with 4 digits. And after I hit apply, instead of having the day as month, day, year, you'll see it as day, month, year, but it's all the same thing. And once again, I'll use the fill handle to apply the formula down to the rest of the rows. And you can see all the formats are adjusting with it. And lastly, we can do custom formats however we want it. So I'll drag that date over to the right, and then I'll go to 1, 2, 3, custom date and time. And this time I want to see a month as an abbreviation, a dash, and then a 4-digit year. So I'll go ahead and delete the day, delete the first slash, change the month to an abbreviation, then put a dash before the year, and then hit apply. And by doing this, you can format the date however you'd like it while keeping it as a date on the back end. Before we start calculating dates, it's important to know how to add the date. And of course, you can just add it into the cell, but the easiest way is to go to Data, Data Validation, Add Rule, then use the Criteria drop down to select Is Valid Date. Then you can double click on the cell and you'll see this pop-out calendar where you can select the date without typing. Alright, so I'm actually going to copy this and paste it in C1, then delete the contents of B1 so I can show you how to do it manually. So we'll type equals, quote, then the date. I'm going to use 12/18, 2023, unquote. And you can add or subtract as many dates as you want. So I can put +1 is the 19th, +45 is February 1st, 2024. Now, if we want to see today's date, we can simply put equals today, open parentheses, close parentheses, and that will give us today's date without any time. Now, if you wanted to have the time down to the second, you could put equals now, open parentheses, close parentheses, and that will give you the timestamp with the full time. Now, an important thing to know is now and today are both live formulas, and they will update whenever you make an edit. To see how many days are in between two different days, you can type equals days and then put the first date in quotes, put a comma, and then you can put the second date in quotes or type today. And once we press enter, the timestamp in the now formula automatically updated. Now, what if we don't want the full days? We just want to see working days. You can type equals net work days, and you can put the start date, comma, the end date. So I'll put today, comma, 5/24/2024 in quotes. And now you can see that out of the 158 days, 115 are work days. The last formula is EO month, which stands for end of month. And for this, you'll type equals EO month, then you'll put a start date. Then you'll put how many months out you want it to be. So I can put 0 and it'll give me the last day of December. And I can change that 0 to a -1, and that will give me the last day of November instead. I can also go into the future, so I could change it from a -1 to a 6, and it'll give me the last day of June, which is 6 months ahead. Now, if you want to find the first of the month, it's super simple as well. So I'll go ahead and put the last day of November, and then I'll put +1, and that will give me the first day of December. And this is a good combo to know, so you can set up different filters and conditions for your formulas. Now, instead of typing out the date, you can select a cell that contains a date, and it'll work the same exact way. And we're going to talk about some miscellaneous important features that we haven't covered yet. First up is find and replace, and it's exactly as it sounds. So say our Western office is moving to the Northwestern region instead. I can go ahead and select all of column A, go to Edit, Find and Replace. I'm going to find the word West, and then I can replace it with Northwest. Then once I hit Replace All, it will update everything to Northwest. And always remember to double check your search range, otherwise you could be replacing values that you didn't intend to. So now you can see in column A, everything that was previously West now says Northwest. You can also use find and replace within a formula. So let's say I want to change Q2 sales to Q3 sales. I can click on the cell, then find Q2 sales, replace with Q3 sales. Then I'll check also search within formulas. Double check the search. In this case, I had all sheets. I don't want that. I just want the cell I selected. Then I'll hit replace all and hit done. So now you can see our return range is Q3 sales instead of Q2 sales. And if you're not familiar with name ranges, go back and watch day 19 to learn all about it. If something looks different about the cell, you can right click on the cell and click Show Edit History. And you can see all the different changes that have happened over time. And that's based on changes for a specific cell. If you want to look at the entire spreadsheet, you can go to File, Version History, Show Version History. And then you can see the different dates that were saved, and you can use the drop down to see different times as well. So you can select a version, and if you want to restore the version, you can do so up top. If you want to investigate further, you can click on the 3 dots to the right and then click Make a Copy, and it will have a whole different spreadsheet for you to investigate. So that's a good way to troubleshoot in case something gets messed up. You can also add comments, so I can right click on Q3 sales and then click Comment, and I can mention somebody and assign them a note. And if I do so, they'll get an email with the information saying that they have access as well as what the note says. And if they don't have access to the spreadsheet already, I can decide permissions from there. And once the comment is actioned, you can click the check mark in the top right corner to resolve it. So comments are meant to be temporary. If you want something more permanent, you can right click and hit Insert Note, and then you can put whatever note you want. So I'll add this note to the region header, and now whenever I hover over the black triangle in the top right corner, you can see what the note says. And you'll use all these functions all the time. Throughout this series, you learned a whole bunch of different skills, but not everybody watched my series, so some people may accidentally mess things up. So it's important to know how to protect your work. So for example, we have our dynamic formula from day 22, and I want people to adjust the region and the company size, but nothing else. To do this, I'll right click on the tab, then click Protect Sheet, and I can add a description that people will see when they get blocked. I can either protect a whole sheet or a specific range, and I can also make it where the entire sheet is selected except for specific cells. So since I want the drop downs to be editable, I'm going to select A2 to B2, then hit OK, then hit Set Permissions. If the spreadsheet is shared with anybody else, you can select whether or not they'll have access to edit the protected ranges, then hit Done. So now the entire sheet is protected except for those 2 cells. To show you what it looks like on the user's end, I'll go to my Not Sheets by Olin account. And if I try to make an edit to a protected cell, I'll get this error message. But I'm still able to use each one of these dropdowns since those cells were excluded from protection. So you can use Protect Range as well as data validation, which we went over in day 17 to control what users can and can't do. And we're going to talk about pivot tables. And if you don't know what a pivot table is, it's a super simple way to quickly summarize data without having to use any formulas. If you ever plan on interviewing for a job where you'll use spreadsheets in your day-to-day life, pivot tables are pretty much always included in the test because it's super important to know how to do. So let's get to it. The first thing you want to do is select your range that you want to pivot. and then you'll go to Insert, Pivot Table. And you can create the pivot table in a new sheet or an existing sheet. I'll go ahead and create one in a new sheet in this case. And once you hit create, a pivot table editor will pop up in a new tab. Now before you start moving things around, you need to decide what your end goal is. So how do you want to summarize this data? So for example, I want to summarize everything by their region. So now you'll see all the regions listed in column A. Now under values, you want to put what data you want to summarize. So I want to summarize the quantity sold and I want to summarize the total. Now by default, it's set to summarize by the sum. But if you use a summarize by dropdown, you can select different types of aggregation. In this case, I'll keep sum because I want to see the total amount of each value type. Now if I exit out of the pivot table editor, you'll see that for each region we have our sum of quantity sold and our sum of total. And if you want to see the entire headers, you can just select the columns and double click on the line in between. And not only do we have the breakdown per region, but we also have the grand total as well. Now let's say that I only want to focus on specific regions. I can click on the pencil to open up the editor, add regions under filter, and then deselect everything except for the specific regions I want to see. And if you're not familiar with filtering, make sure to go back and watch Sheetsmith's Day 13. So now you can see that the pivot table only reflects the two regions that I selected. Now if I wanted to break this down even further, I could drag status under columns. And just to clean this up, I'm going to rename the column names to number sold and total amount. And if you change the name for one of the columns, it will automatically update for the rest of the columns. Now I'm going to resize the columns to get everything into one screen, just like I did before. And I can see that we have the values broken up by the status good, by the status poor, and the grand total. And if you look at the numbers for the grand total, this is the pivot table that we had before, but now we can see a more granular view. And if we didn't want the grand view, we could simply deselect show totals under status, and now we just have it broken down by good and poor. So in just a couple of minutes, you're able to get a nice performance summary of the Northeast and Southeast region without having to do a single formula. And I don't know if there's a single human alive that's old enough to be on TikTok that doesn't know what a chart is, but it's just a visual representation of data. And it's also called a graph. So the first thing that we want to do is select the range that we want to create the chart from. So I'll select this entire table right here, then I'll go to Insert, Chart. And once you click Chart, it will bring up the chart editor, and this is where you customize everything. So if you go to chart type, you can see a whole bunch of different types like line charts, column charts, bar charts, pie charts, etc. And there's also different types of charts that fall within each category as well. So for example, you can have column charts, you can have stat column charts, etc. And for this chart, I want a basic column chart. And depending on the type of data that you select, it could be quite messy if you have a lot of extra data that you're not going to use. So I'm going to clean things up by selecting Use Row 1 as header. Then I'll select Aggregate. And I don't need all of these series, so I'm going to go ahead and click the three dots and select for Move for all of the series except for one. Now for the x-axis, we have region. I'm going to click on that label and select status instead. So now our x-axis is status. And then instead of quantity sold, I want the series to be total. Now I'm going to exit out of this chart editor and I'm going to click on the chart and I'm going to cut it and then paste it in a tab by itself. That way it's a little bit easier to read. Alright, so now you can see that we have the total amounts based on the status just like we set up. And I know that because I made it, but the chart itself is not giving very much context, so we need to go back into it and customize it. So under the Customize section, you have a lot of different options, one of which is Chart and Axis Titles. So I can select Chart Title and then type in Total Amount Sold. And by default, that chart title will populate in the top left of the chart. I can use a drop down to select Chart Subtitle and put By Status, and that subtitle will populate just underneath the chart title. Now I can go back to the drop down and click Horizontal Axis Title and put Status, and the horizontal axis title is also known as the x-axis. Then I can click the vertical axis title, which is also known as the y-axis, and put amount sold in US dollars. So now if we exit out of the chart editor, you can see that people have a lot more context to what they're looking at. An alternative to navigating the editor is simply double click on whatever you want to customize and it'll bring you straight to that part of the editor. So for example, if I want to change the color of this series, I can. All I have to do is just change the fill color. I can also add data labels. And as you can see, I have green bars and data labels. And you can play around with this until you find something that you like. So you can change the bars to yellow, for example, or you can change them to blue. The most important part is to make sure it's legible. So that's a basic bar chart. And if you get through this and you decide that you don't like the bar chart, you can transform it into a different type of chart. So for example, here is a donut chart. And all the different customizations that you selected previously that are transferable will remain the same. For example, the chart title. And once again, if I want to change the color, I can simply double click on it and select a new color. Fully visible at all times, you can see what percent of the amounts fall within each status. And if you want to see the exact amounts, you can simply hover over it. And simply put, slicers are just a way to filter data away from the dataset itself. The first thing you want to do is select the range you want to filter. So I'll select this entire table, then I'll go to Data, Add a Slicer. And it will populate this black oval, which is the slicer. I'm going to go ahead and cut this and then go to our Slicers tab and paste it right above. So now I have my slicer, then I have my chart, and I have my pivot table as well. I'll click on Select Column first, then I'll select Region from the dropdown. And in this case, I'm going to make sure that Apply to Pivot Tables is checked. Now I'm going to move this slicer a little bit up, then I'll exit out of the editor. And now I can filter just like normal. So I can filter by just Northeast and Southeast, and my chart will update automatically with the new data as well as my pivot table. And you can have as many slicers as you'd like. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the slicer, then I'll paste it to the right and I'll paste it beneath. So now I can filter the data 3 different ways. On the slicer to the right, I'm going to assign the column status. And for the slicer below, I'm going to assign quantity sold as the column. And now we can filter just like normal. So I'm going to uncheck poor for the status, and now you can see that we only have results for good. And for quantity sold, it's way too much work to check and deselect which ones you want. So instead, we're going to filter by condition. I'll select greater than or equals to, and I'll put 75. And once I hit OK, you can see that the chart and the pivot table updated to reflect the new filters. And if you want to see all the data again, you can just remove all the filters that you set up in each slicer. So this is a super simple way to slice and dice to analyze data pretty quickly. We're going to talk about array formulas. And in my opinion, array formulas are one of the most slept on formulas in all of Google Sheets, and it's one of the formulas that sets itself apart from Excel. And I like to use array formulas to automate pretty much my entire spreadsheet. First, I'm going to show you the way that the array formula works in both Excel and Google Sheets, and then I'm going to show you the way that it only works in Google Sheets. On day 5, we learned how to set up a median formula. So I'm going to set up a median formula for Q1 sales. But what if we want to find a median for a specific region? There is no median if formula, so we need to create one. So I'm going to add an if formula, which we went over on day 10. So as you can see, we get this error message, and it's essentially saying that we need to turn this into an array formula for it to work. And if you don't know what an array is, it's just another word for a range. Between equals and median, I'm going to add the array formula, and you can use the hotkeys on the screen or type it in yourself. And as you can see, we now have a result for the region, and if I change the region, we now have a new result based on the new region. And the reason why this works is because the if formula is going through all the region, and it's trying to look up the region that we have tagged, and it's saying whether it's true or false, and that's why it doesn't work without the array formula. So the array formula portion is saying that if the region is true, we want to take the median of Q1 sales. Alright, so that's the way to use the array formula in both Google Sheets and Excel, but now we're going to show the way that only works in Google Sheets. On the array formula tab, I want to pull a bunch of data from different tabs. So I want to pull the associate and the region from the roster, the sales information from the sales, and the quarterly targets from the quarterly targets tab. So I'll go to the array formula tab, and in cell B2 under associate, I'll type equals. Then I'll go to roster and click on the first associate, then do :B. And this gives me a single value, but if I add an array formula before it, it gives me every single value on that list. And it works as if I had equals B2, equals B3, equals B4, etc. And since it goes to the end of the column, if I add a new associate to the roster, it will automatically be populated to the list. And the array formula works with all sorts of formulas. So for region, I can do XLookup and then select the search key. And then on roster, I'll select the lookup range and the result range. And once again, I only have one value. To turn it into an array formula, we'll add array formula between equals and XLookup, and we'll change B2 to B2: B. So as you can see, anything with an associate has a value, and if it doesn't have an associate, it has an error message. So in the XLookup formula, we need to add comma, quote, quote, so that way it's blank if there is no value. And if you're not familiar with the XLookup function, go back and watch day 9 and you'll know all about it. Now we'll create another XLookup formula, but this time we're going to look up Q1 sales from the sales tab. And once again, we only get one result, but we can turn this into an array formula by changing it to B2: B and adding array formula between equals and XLookup. And to keep things clean, I'm going to fix the format in cell C2, and I'm going to add it so it's blank if the values are missing. I'm also going to anchor in the search key, and then I'm going to change the lookup range and the result range to go all the way through the end of their columns. And lastly, I'm going to anchor in the lookup range as well. And if you're not familiar with anchoring, go back and watch day 8. Now I'm going to use the fill handle to shift the formula over to Q2 and Q3 sales. And you can see that the result column shifts with it, and it matches the Q2 and Q3 sales exactly on the sales tab. Now I'm going to do the same exact thing, but this time instead of referencing the sales tab, I'm going to reference the quarterly targets to find what targets were for Q1, Q2, and Q3. I'm going to anchor in the lookup range, and I'll go ahead and put the search key as B2: B and anchor that in and turn it into an array formula. And once again, I need to add the missing values portion. So in the array formula, I'll put comma, quote, quote, so that way it's blank if there's missing values. And that formula is now done, so I can drag it over using the fill handle. So as you can see, we have a whole bunch of different results, but the only formulas that exist are in row 2. And since we configured everything to be through the end of the rows, if we add a new person to the roster, it will automatically flow through with any results that they have. So for example, we're going to add Ella Phillips to the roster, and once we put all the information in, we can go to the array formula tab, and she's automatically populated into associate, and all of her details are populated as well. So that's how to use the array formula and how to use it to automate your spreadsheets. We're going to talk about named ranges. The named ranges function is often slept on, but it can save you so much time when you're configuring spreadsheets if you use it correctly. In day 18, we set up these XLookup formulas mixed with an array formula, and you might remember that I had to go back and forth between different spreadsheets to set these up. And that's because we needed to pull different data from different tabs. So for example, this one has a lookup range in the sales tab in column B, and we're returning column C in the sales tab as well. To speed up building my formulas, I'm going to go to the sales tab, and I'm going to click on each of the columns, and then just to the left of the formula bar, I'm going to rename them as Q1 sales, Q2 sales, and Q3 sales. I'm also going to rename column B as sales underscore associate, and the underscore is needed because spaces are not allowed with name ranges. So now if I click on the different headers, you can see the names populate. I can also use the drop down for the formula bar to see exactly what name ranges exist, as well as the ranges that they are associated with. And I can go to data named ranges to see a full list as well. Now I can go back to my name ranges tab, and I can reconfigure all of my formulas very easily without having to leave the tab once. Now I'll start typing the formula. If you're not familiar with XLookup, check out day 9, and if you're not familiar with the array formula, check out day 18. So I'll put equals XLookup, and then the search key will be B2:B to make it an array formula. Then I'll put comma, start typing sales associate, and I'll select sales associate. Then I'll put comma, Q1 sales, comma, quote, quote, and then I'll make this an array formula. And you can see that we have the same exact results as we previously had, but instead of having ranges in there, we have named ranges. I'm going to anchor in our search key so it doesn't move when we shift over the formula. If you're not familiar with anchoring, go back and watch day 8. And name ranges are already anchored in, so you don't need to worry about those. I'll change Q1 to Q2 within the name range, and then I'll do it again and change Q2 to Q3. And not only is the formula easier to build, but the formula is actually easier to read as well. And we're going to talk about dynamic formulas. Through the course of this series, you learned a whole bunch of different formulas, but now I'm going to show you how to make them all dynamic. In this spreadsheet, we have a couple of different dropdowns for our criteria. And if you're not familiar with dropdowns, go back and watch day 11. And we'll also use the SUMIFS formula, and if you don't know SUMIFS, go back and watch day 6. So for our formula, we'll type equals SUMIFS, and then we'll select our sum range. Then I'll put a comma and select our criterion range, which will be our region. Then I'll select A2, which is our criterion. Then I'll do the same for company size, where B2 is the criterion. So now if I select different options, the result will populate, but if one of the options is missing, I'll get a 0. And I don't want this since I want to have a result for each option by itself, so I'm going to add a wildcard and a join to the criterions. And if you're not familiar with these, go back and watch days 6 and 7. So in front of the first criterion, I'll put quote asterisk quote, ampersand, the cell, ampersand, quote asterisk quote. Then I'll do the same exact thing for the second criterion. And this will make it fully dynamic, so whether an option is selected or not, the results will populate. So since we have no company size selected, you'll see the total for the region across all company sizes. And if we select a company size and delete the region, you'll see the total for that company size across all regions. And this same concept will work for a whole bunch of different formulas in Google Sheets to make them dynamic. We're going to talk about various if-based formulas. And at its core, an if formula is just an if then else statement. And it's a pretty simple formula. So the computer will look at the statement, and if the statement's true, it'll return one value, otherwise it will return a different value. So for the formula, I'll type equals if, and then we need a logical expression. So I'll put B2 is greater than 50. And if it's true, I want it to read good. And if it's false, I want it to read poor. And as we've discussed in prior days, any text has to be in quotes for it to work. Now I'll press enter and I'll accept the suggested autofill since that's the same thing as dragging down the formula to the rest of the rows. And you can see in every single row, if the quantity sold is above 50, it reads good. Otherwise, it reads poor. Now similarly, you can have something called a nested if statement. And with this, you're still doing that if then else statement. But instead of having it end with one else, you're going to have another if statement built in there. So for example, I'll put if C2 is less than 400, then if it's true, I'll return fail, and it will stop right there. If it's false, then it will continue on to the next logical expression. So I'll put if C2 is less than 800. If it's true, it'll be okay. If not, it'll be if C2 is less than 1200. If that's true, it'll be good. Otherwise, it'll be great. And I'll accept the suggested autofill again to apply that formula to the rest of the rows. And you can see it all applied correctly. So for example, 450 is above 400, so it's not reading fail. Instead, it's reading okay because it's between 400 and 800. And the order that you list these logical expressions in is super important because it will stop at the first true. Now, if I drag this formula down to somewhere that does not have data, it'll give me a false result, and that's because it's blank. But there's a super simple way to account for this. So I'll go back to my original formula, and in between the equals and the if, I'll type if, open parentheses, is blank, open parentheses, select C2, close parentheses. Then I'll put a comma and drag the formula bar down a little bit so you can see better. Then I'll put quote, quote. And then I'll put a comma and I'll press enter. And what this is saying is if C2 is blank, then the result will be blank. Otherwise, I'll continue with the formula. Now I'll use the fill handle to drag this formula down past the end of the rows. And you can see that it's blank, but if I type a number in the total, the results will populate automatically. And this is a good way to set up your formulas to anticipate future data. Alright, so now we're going to talk about if in A and if error, because data is not always clean and we're going to have errors that populate. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a VLookup formula. And if you don't know about VLookup, go back and watch Sheetsmith's Day 8 and you'll know all about it. And once I press enter, you'll see that John Smith has quantity sold of 66. Now if I change the name from John Smith to Josh Smith, you'll see an NA error pop up, and that's because Josh Smith does not exist in the lookup range. And you're not always going to find a result, so the way to handle this is type if NA before the formula, then after put comma, you can put whatever you want in quotes. So I'll put not found and press enter. So this is saying if NA is the result, then instead of showing NA, it will show not found instead. Next, I'll create an XLookup formula, and if you don't know about XLookup, go back and watch Sheetsmith's Day 9 to know all about it. And you can see that Emily Johnson sold 30, but if we change the spelling, you'll see that NA error again. But XLookup actually has the ability to handle missing values within that formula. So after the result range, put comma, then you can put the missing value result after that. So I'll put comma, quote, not found, quote, and it works the same exact way as the if NA formula. But let's say I'm doing a calculation and I'm dividing a number by 0. Instead of having an NA error, I'm having a value error instead. And you'll also see a div 0 formula when you divide by 0. But if you want to encompass any type of error, you can type equals if error, then the formula, then after the formula, whatever you want to return. And this works the same exact way as the other formulas. If you don't have an error, then it will get the result of the formula. If you do have an error, it will show whatever you put. And we're going to talk about filtering. And when I say filtering, I mainly mean the filter formula, but we're going to talk about basic filtering as well. Alright, so to set up a basic filter, all we have to do is select the range we want to filter. And if you know additional data is going to be added later on, it's best to go past the last row of the table, otherwise it may not be included in the filter. Next, I'll go to the toolbar and select Create a Filter, and just a reminder the 3 dots that you see on my screen are only there because I'm using a small screen. And now you'll see the triangle in each header, and that's where we filter. So I can go into Status, for example, and deselect Good, and I only have Poor left. On top of filtering by independent values, you can also filter by condition. So I can go to Quantity Sold and select greater than or equal to. I can put 20, and now I'll only see rows that have a greater than or equal to 20. You can also filter by different text conditions. So for example, I can go to Region and put text contains West, and now you'll see that anything with West in the name still remains. And one thing to know is if you want to filter by condition, all the values underneath must be checked for the filter by condition to work. Now I'm going to clear all the filters that we just did and go to the Filter tab. Then in cell A4, I'm going to select Filter, and then I'm going to select the range that I want to filter, and this will be the same range as last time, with the exception of the header, and that's only because I already have it listed. So after I select my range, I'll put a comma, and then I'll put my first condition. So in this case, I want to have the condition where I want to filter based off of the region, if the region is equal to Midwest. So now you can see my filter formula only shows data for regions in the Midwest. And if I didn't want to show all the data, I could simply alter the range that I'm filtering. And the range that you're returning doesn't even need to include the column that you're filtering. And with this filter formula, you can do as many filters as you'd like. So for example, if I wanted to filter by the total, or if I wanted to filter by the quantity sold, I could. So after Midwest, I could put a comma and do my second condition. And for my second condition, I want to filter by quantity sold. So I'll go ahead and select my range that I want to filter. Just keep in mind that the number of rows you want to filter have to match in each condition. After the range, I'll put greater than or equals to 30, and then press enter. So now you can see that I'm only showing data with anything that has quantity sold greater than or equal to 30, and is also in the region of the Midwest. Now I'm sure you're saying all that's cool, but I can do that with basic filtering, so what's the point? And the point is you can make it dynamic to filter through data pretty easily. So for example, in A2, I have a dropdown with every single one of the regions. So instead of having the filter criteria being equals to Midwest, I can simply say equals to cell A2. And now I can filter by different regions by just using the dropdown. Similarly, instead of filtering the second condition by 30, I can put equals to cell B2. And now it will filter based on whatever number's there. Now we're getting it in A because 600 is way too high, but if I change that to 30, we'll have results. And then I can use the dropdown to change the region to see the results for the new region. If I want to, I can edit the filter range to include status and results again. And I can make column A a little bit wider to keep everything visible. Now, even with the filtered range, you can still do basic filtering. So if I wanted to see which results are in the southeast and above 30, but have a result of good, I could. We're going to talk about data validation. And simply put, data validation is just controlling what people can and can't do on your spreadsheet. And this is super important because people will mess up your spreadsheets all the time, whether they mean to or not. In cell B2, I have 1000, and then all my other rows have a formula that's based off of that original value. So I want to make sure that nobody can change this original value. So I'll click on B2, then go to Data, Data Validation, Add Rule. And you can see it says Apply to Range B2. I'll use the criteria drop down to select is equal to, then I'll put 1000. And if the data is invalid, I want to reject the input. Now I'm going to hit Done and exit out. So now if anything other than 1000 gets typed in cell B2, it will reject the input and keep 1000. And you can also protect the cell instead, but that's how to do it with data validation. Alright, so now we have a start date for each employee, and we want to make sure that it only allows for valid days to be input. So we'll go to Data, Data Validation, then we'll click Add Rule and use the criteria drop down to select Is Valid Date, and if the data is invalid, we'll reject the input as well. We'll hit Done and exit out of this. So by doing this, you can actually double click on the cell and a little pop-up calendar will appear for you to select another date without having to type it in. And the cell is protected, so if I try to type something else that's not a date in there, it will be rejected. Next, I want to set up a dropdown for department, so I'm going to go ahead and select the range I want to apply the dropdown to. Then I'll go to Data, Data Validation, and then I'll click Add Rule. And I actually want to use the dropdown from a range since I have a list of these teams that are available over here to the right. So I will select the range that I want the options for. And once I hit OK, you can see that each one of these teams is now an option for the dropdown. And even if the list had duplicates, it would only show each unique option. I'll add a different color for each option, then click on Advanced Options. I want to make sure that Reject the Input is selected, then hit Done. Now I'm going to go to my original dropdown, and you can see that each option now exists. And if I decide that I don't like these options and want to add something else, it will block me from being able to do so. Now we need to create a dropdown for status, so I'll select the range that we want to apply the dropdown to, then go to Data, Data Validation, Add Rule. And there's only two options, so this time we're going to use the drop-down criteria and just manually type in each one of these options. So I would type in active and then inactive, and I'll assign a different color for each. So this time I'll click on Advanced Options, and instead of having Reject the Input, I'll put Show a Warning. Then I'll hit Done and exit out of this. So now if I try to overwrite one of the options, it will accept it. You'll just see a red triangle in the top right corner saying that it's invalid and why. So that's a few different data validations that you'll use frequently. There's a lot of other data validations that you can do as well. So I'll go to Data, Data Validations, Add Rule. So from the criteria drop down, you have text contains or text does not contain a certain value, text is exactly, text is a valid email, or text is a valid URL. Then you can validate different dates or numbers based on different operators like greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, etc. You can add a checkbox, which we went over on day 11, so make sure to check that out. And you can also do custom formulas, so that way if you want to make sure there are no duplicates allowed or anything like that, you can do so there. So that's data validation. If you like this video, follow Sheets by Olin for more.